Good evening, and welcome to Development, Recognition, and Justice, our Emancipation Roundtable. I'd like to bring special greetings to the Chairman of UTT, Professor Clement Imber, Vice President of Research, Academic, and Student Affairs, and Acting President of UTT, Professor Prakash Prasad, esteemed panelists, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen of our audience, Idul Adha Mubarak and happy emancipation. And thank you for joining us this evening. I would like to turn over now to Professor Imber to bring a welcome.
Okay, good evening, everybody, panelists, and all those who are listening and viewing. I've been asked to give some opening remarks. I wasn't given any specific topic to talk on, but what I'll try to do is to set the stage. And I hope I don't preempt anybody's contribution. As we know, the transatlantic slave trade, sometimes referred to as the Atlantic slave trade, involved the transportation by Britain and continental Europe of enslaved people, largely from Central and West Africa, mainly to the Americas, including the Caribbean. They were transported by ship through the so-called Middle Passage from the 16th and 19th centuries for over 300 years. Slavery, of course, existed before this and has occurred from ancient times, since mankind moved from the age of hunters and gatherers to the stage of settled civilizations. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, perhaps the most significant record of large-scale organized slavery was the so-called Arab slave trade. However, by far the most extensive by volume and the most barbaric form of slavery was the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese in the fairly early 16th century were the first to engage in this trade with a shipment to Brazil, which accounted for the largest number of slaves. Other European countries soon followed, transporting Africans to various parts of the Americas. Some estimates are, and their estimates were even higher, that over 12 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, and many died en route. Furthermore, their offspring were legally the chattel property of their owners, thus vastly increasing the number of slaves over the centuries of slavery. After over 300 years of struggle against the most oppressive and cruel system of slavery, struggle was waged by the slaves themselves and others, including the abolitionist movement, and it was legally abolished. Following official emancipation in 1938, after proclamation in 34 and passing of the law in 33, of course, in the British Empire and 1965 in the United States, the discrimination and brutalization of Africans continued, institutionalized, openly in some cases, subtly in other cases, by the state, the private sector, and sadly condoned by the church. After abolition, Jim Crow laws were enacted to enforce racial segregation in the southern United States, which doctrine was reinforced by the US Supreme Court in the so-called separate but equal facilities for African Americans. But of course, we all know that those facilities and all other spheres of life were not equal for African Americans, including education, transportation, and various other areas. It took another 100 years after official emancipation in the US for these laws to be officially repealed, in 65. But nothing much changed in reality. And though there were no such laws or official segregation in the northern states and in many other parts of the world, including the Caribbean, discrimination, denial, and oppression continued and were just as real. So the struggle for true liberation, justice, and equality continued up to today and has taken place in many forms in different parts of the world, in Africa and in the African diaspora. Notable freedom fighters in the US include, of course, Frederick Douglass, himself a slave, W.B. Du Bois, Martin coming right up to Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, and of late Al Sharpton. These are some of the better known names. King was the most notable of the more modern freedom fighters, and from 1965 to his death in 68, organized several boycotts and marches to great effect, most notably the year-long Montgomery March. We all remember Rosa Parks, and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, as it was called, in 1963, August 28th, where he delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. But there were and are many others in the US, including our own Trinidad-born Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture. Other notable Trinidad freedom fighters in the US, in the UK, and so were Henry Sylvester Williams, who in 1900 organized the first Pan-African conference held in London, and other Pan-Africans like George Padmore and C.L.R. James. They were prolific writers and activists, and especially when they were based in London from the 1930s. Padmore and James, in particular, were associated at that time, 30s, 40s, even up to the 50s, with many luminaries in the cause, such as Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, and South Africa's Peter Abrahams, among many others, of course. The African independence movement accelerated in the 20th century with several struggles for independence in European-ruled African territories. Some of these struggles manifested themselves in revolts, such as the Mau Mau Uprising, as it is often called, and wars in countries such as Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, among others. Standout early liberation leaders in Africa included, of course, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, we mentioned before, and later Robert Mugabe. In South Africa, the most notable were Nelson and Winnie Mandela, of course, Desmond Tutu, Steve Biko, among, again, many others. There were parallel struggles in the Caribbean, but they were non-violent, at least in the English-speaking, the Commonwealth Caribbean, as we often call it. Independence leaders in this part of the world, in the Commonwealth Caribbean, include Alexander Bustamante in Jamaica, Eric Williams in Trinidad and Tobago, Forbes Burnham in Guyana, and there were notable others in several of the islands. I think Chedi Jagan, although he was not the one at independence, the ruler at independence, I think he deserves honorable mention also. And of course, the latest very public manifestations of the struggle is the Black Lives Matter movement, advocating in protest against incidents of police brutality and extended to all racially motivated violence and other forms of oppression against African Americans and the people of African descent. This started in July, the term started in July 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin in February 2012. And of course, there were several other protests after that. We know that outside in Missouri, there were demonstrations. And then, of course, the movement exploded in the US and globally with the George Floyd murder by Minnesota police. Earlier this month, the statue of Sir George Picton, who was, of course, governor of Trinidad at one time, was removed from the Cardiff City Hall in Wales. Picton was the most senior military officer killed during the famous Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and so was hailed a hero. But he was also known to use the slave trade as well. Furthermore, he was sadistic. So Thomas, if you want to call him that, Picton, had a dozen slaves executed during his time as governor here in Trinidad during his colonial rule, and was convicted of torturing a 14-year-old girl, but this was overturned in a retrial 2 years later before he served any time. Now in Cardiff, the first black mayor of Cardiff, Dan Diath, whose father was from Antigua, had called for the statue of Picton, whom he called a sadistic 19th century slave owner, to be removed. And this, of course, after several such incidents, and a well-known one is the removal of the statue of Sir Edward Colston in Bristol by the Black Lives Movement protest that, as I said, has taken place all over the world. With close to over 20 million people in the United States, the biggest single sort of collective event in the United States and in many other parts of the world. Now, what is important is Diath, the mayor of Cardiff. He has set up a task force to establish what more can be done in this regard. And also, a description of Picton's links to slavery is now accompanying his portrait hanging in Windsor Castle in the Queen's collection. And the First Minister of Wales has ordered an urgent audit of statues, street names, and buildings to address Wales's association with the slave trade. I need to emphasize that we need to follow suit in Trinidad and Tobago to recognize our own. We need to set up such a commission to examine street names, statues, building names, and other such things, parks, etc. And of course, there's a burning issue of reparation, with Hilary Beckles being the latest leading light. He's not the first by far, but the latest leading light in the Caribbean. Now, let us think. A memorial plaque of Henry Sylvester was unveiled in London in 2007 on the site of his former home. And one in Padmore, who in his later life went to Ghana and helped with the Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party. There are several things. There's a library in Ghana, as we all know, in Accra, named after him. John LaRose, another political and cultural activist from Transatlantic, founded the George Padmore Institute in London. There's a plaque in Padmore's former address in London. And in Kenya, there are two streets named after Padmore. One is called George Padmore Lane and George Padmore Road. Now, some people posit that the abolition of slavery and African slavery in particular is not worthy of celebration, that word celebration, because of the abject barbarism of slavery. Whatever word one uses, celebration, commemoration, observance, or remembrance, it is a time for reflection and a recognition of the struggles to get where we are. Far from over, of course. So from Henry Sylvester to George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Chubal, Uriah Buzz Butler, Adrian Colarienzi, in part, John LaRose, Eric Williams, Lloyd Bess, McCandle Dagger, Kafra Cambon, UTT's own Winston Sweet and Hollis Liverpool in his own way, the mighty Chalkbus, among many others. Trinidad and Tobago has a number of illustrious sons of the soil who have contributed nationally and internationally to the fight for the true liberation of Black people, a struggle that is very far from over. And this country can hold its head high in the knowledge that it is the first country in the world to declare August the 1st a national holiday in recognition of the introduction in the British Empire on August the 1st, 1934, of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1933. I went, I think, a little over my allotted time, but I prepared things. Many of these things I know, but I had to prepare something. And thank you. I hope I haven't stolen the thunder of anybody who is to talk later on. Thank you very much. And I was told I could leave, but I will stay the course. When my wife arrives, I'll just tell her not to make any noise, to shut up and let me hear what everybody else has to say. If you don't mind, I will often take off my ugly face from your face, but I am here throughout. But I'll leave my face on for a little while. I want you to admire my nice Ghanaian camise that my wife bought me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Imber. Kind of odd saying thank you after you talked about your ugly face. No one has an ugly face. Thank you so much for bringing greetings and welcome. It is my honor, and I should introduce myself. My name is Dr. Kayla Naka Francis. I'm an assistant professor in the Academy of Arts, Letters, Culture, and Public Affairs at UTT. I am a carnivalist and particularly interested in African rituals in secular spaces. So when they said we're having an emancipation roundtable, I was like, when, where, and how can I help? It's my privilege also to tell you what this talk is about. Really, we're looking at emancipation, the event, and emancipation, the process. And in keeping with the celebration of emancipation, we're here to discuss how we're here to clear up any misconceptions that there might be surrounding the event, and to discuss how the process has been going in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, our successes, where we still need to go, and all that, because emancipation is foremost, as a holiday, a celebration, and we want to keep that celebration alive. I will go, I'm not sure if everyone see the same order as me, but I'll just go in clockwise order from my left. So with us today to discuss these hopefully heavy but educational and entertaining topic is N2 Springer, who I should say no one on this panel really needs any introduction, but I will introduce anyway. Trinidadian poet, playwright, performer, mother, grandmother, activist, founding member of the Ida Keda Group, founder and first director of the National Heritage Library, foundation member and first cultural chair of the Emancipation Support Committee. In addition to writing and publishing 6 books, she writes and directs the annual Cambule production, documenting the resistance of our ancestors. She has received a national award for her contribution to art and culture, and an award from the National Drama Association for her contribution to theater. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Dr. Brinsley Samaru, now a retired but professor of history at University of West Indies, served as a senator, minister, and member of parliament in the government. His publications include The Art of Garnet Eiffel, Glimpses of the Sugar Industry, and The Price of Conscience, Howard Nankiville, and Labor Unrest in the Caribbean in 1937 and 1938. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, right, good. Yeah.
We also have Dr. Roger Henry, a conductor, composer, and educator currently serving as an assistant professor of music and program leader for the Academy of the Performing Arts at UTT. In addition to his role in the university, he maintains a national profile in the music community as the artistic director and conductor of the National Philharmonic Orchestra and assistant artistic director for the Marionettes Chorale. And has, I'm lost. I lose myself. Oh, that was my editing. Welcome, Dr. Henry.
Thank you for having me.
And we have with us as well Kafra Kambon, one of the leaders of the Black Power movement, an economist, Pan-Africanist, and the recipient of the Shakonia Medal Silver Medal for community work. He is the author of the book For Bread, Justice, and Freedom, a political biography of George Weeks. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and good evening to all you panelists.
So just to clarify for our audience, this is a roundtable discussion, and it will follow very loosely discussion questions, and anyone, anytime, feel free, weigh in, comment. At the end of the session, we will be taking questions and answers from the audience. So please feel free to comment, leave questions in the comment bar on YouTube or whatever platform you're looking. So let's jump right into it. One of the common misconceptions is that emancipation was given to us out of sheer kindness. How would you clarify this misconception? Feel free, anyone, to jump in.
Well, I suppose I could begin.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
We know, as I was saying to you earlier, our history, our historians, enough respect to Brinsley, has not done a very good job in informing us about who we are, about how we have fought for against enslavement. And what we learn is that our ancestors fought and fought and fought by any means necessary. There is a list of revolts and revolutions across. I mean, I was just looking at my CLR James, and he says the first enslaved came to Haiti in 1510. The first revolution was in 1532. In our own Trinidad and Tobago, we had revolts in Plain Palais, we had the Dagger Revolution, we had unrest against people like Begora, cruel slave master who tried to kill off everybody who believed in African spirituality. We had revolution in 1805. And then we had passive resistance as well, sabotage, feigning of illness. Now the documentation is happening. Professor Imbe, in his very lucid and wide-ranging remark, was able to speak so fulsomely about things that happen in the States, revolts and all of that. But it is not widespread, our revolts, our 1805, our 1845, our 1881, our 1903, our 1930s, our 1884s, Tobago 1770, 1776. We do not know. We do not know. And at the Cambule, you know, I had this experience of going to the school right next to Piccadilly to do a workshop. And that Cambule riot that happened right there, around there. Neither the teachers nor children even knew that it existed. So you're looking at an African population that does not know that it has a history of defiance, of fighting, of survival. And so the lack of that knowledge, the lack of contribution to their own well-being, as distinct from the notion that somebody handed you freedom, makes a whole difference to people's sense of self, to people's sense of self-worth, so to a people's love of self and understanding of the role and contribution they have made to their own freedom.
I would add something. I agree with all that my sister said, but I can't do anything else. But with all that my sister said. But I would just like to say that for me, my liberators are Dessalines, Boukman, Toussaint. They were some of the principal fighters of the Haitian Revolution. And to me, that changed, that turned things around where the enslavement of African people in this region is concerned. That was a major turning point for all of us. And the British who had colonized us in Trinidad and other parts of the Caribbean and Tobago and other parts of the Caribbean, they saw growing. And this is just an example of what was taking place as a result of the Haitian Revolution, which made all those who enslaved our people in the region very nervous. But you look at what happened in the territories that Britain had stolen, and you find that after Haiti in 1804 took their independence, they had uprisings to suppress in Barbados in 1816. That's a uprising of the enslaved Africans. 1823, they had to deal with a similar situation in Guyana. 1831, 32, they had to deal with it in Jamaica. And that was the pattern throughout the region. So that if we are going to look at emancipation, we must look at those revolutionary struggles. I mean, there was passive resistance and all those things, but we also have to look at the impact of those revolutionary struggles. And I know there are historians who could deal with things like the economics and all of that. So I just want to make that brief comment on that aspect of it.
Yeah, could I come in?
Please do.
Yeah.
I expect my professor to come in.
Yeah, let me just say, first of all, that it's a very good thing that we're having this emancipation, that it coincides with Eid al-Fitr, which is a very important Muslim celebration, because it was the Black Muslims from North America who introduced Islam into Trinidad after the Anglo-American War of 1815. And under their Imam Abu Bakr, they established a very vibrant Muslim community in the Hondo River area. And there were also Muslims who came in, before emancipation. These are Muslims who were brought from North America, free Muslims in a slave society. So I think that is a very important event that we should commemorate at this time of Eid al-Fitr. And for Muslims, the fact that Africans brought Islam to the Caribbean is equally important. And even though I've given the Trinidad example, I think it is equally true to talk about Jamaica and the Guyanas and so on, where Muslims who were slaves, in fact, brought Islam to the Caribbean. The other point I want to make is somebody asked the question, what was the major reason for the abolition of slavery? Well, it was quite clear that slavery had become uneconomical, and instead of having people to produce but who couldn't buy, we had the Industrial Revolution in England. So you had to create a clientele to buy all the industrial things that the English and the Europeans were producing, so that they emancipated the Africans to enslave them once again by socializing them into an appreciation of things European, food, dress, everything, books, so that the emancipation took place largely because slavery, enslaving people who could not purchase your goods, didn't make sense. So you free them, I use the word freedom in inverted commas, to be enslaved by your socialization of them into European patterns. The third thing I want to say is that this whole emancipation celebration and the continuing work that we have to do should not concentrate on the history of victimology. Africans were oppressed. This happened and that happened, and they underwent enormous oppression and so on. We've had enough of that. What I think, rather than concentrating on this issue of victimology, we should be very positive and talk about the enormous contributions that Africans made to New World civilization during slavery and afterwards. And if we are thinking of persons to whom we should make statues, we have an enormous range of them. I have to disagree with Onto to say that the work has not been done or is not being done. Let me tell you that the EU historians have done an enormous amount of work, and work is going on. The real difficulty in the society has been that the work that we have been doing is not taken up by the larger society and dispersed dispersed, throughout the nation. And I think that's a problem that we must face. There is no dearth, I'm repeating that, of this positive view of the African in the Caribbean. There's no dearth of work. The work is there. The problem really is in the collation, collection of work that is there, one, and two, in disseminating that among our young people. It is very unfortunate that a country that had a historian as its first prime minister has so neglected the teaching of history in the secondary schools, and we in the university are feeling that backlash because, let's say 10, 15 years ago, when you'd have a class of 65 or 70, it is now 15 and 20. And that, to my mind, is a tragedy because history is being sorely neglected in the primary and the secondary school system. And as a result, the work that we are doing, we have done and continue to do is not being disseminated. So that if my colleagues who are here and groups that are listening wish to have lists of what we've done and the enormous contribution that Africans have made to the new world, that's not a problem at all. That could be given in minutes. But the problem is in disseminating that information that is there, that is sitting, disseminating that information throughout the society. And I wish people could address us, because it's not a lack of information. I'm emphasizing that. It is a lack of the distribution, the disbursement, the spreading of that information, which is precisely what NJAC did in 1969-70. NJAC didn't say, we go to the secondary school and we go to that secondary school. They used historians like me and Revere and a whole set of us to go down where people lived and to talk about this enormous contribution of the African in the Caribbean.
If I may, I am really heartened to hear Professor Samaru speak so freely and passionately about history. So in my role at UGT, I teach music history as one of the courses. And one of the main focus for the way I teach history is that the history of music is the history of the people who made it, the people who listened to it and loved it and enjoyed it, and why it all came to be. And the approach that I take is I say, here is this found thing. Here's an artifact that comes from history. Let's look at how it was used, why it was used, and let's try to see what do we take from this into the music that we make today. Where do we see traditions that have extended themselves for centuries into the current day in the music that we have? And how can we continue to learn from history and build upon the history that we are making as a newly independent nation and a republic? You know, when I think of emancipation, I always, that Bob Marley song always pops into my head, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. And it reminds me that emancipation is not just a thing that happened around the world to people who were previously enslaved. It is a mental process that a people take themselves through. And I, as a musician and as a composer and as someone who studies the way music evolves, I like to think of what does it mean to be emancipated? And for me, part of that answer is that we take up the call of the cultural ideas that have come from the people who have lived these lives. And, you know, emancipation and culture are inextricably linked. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a number of vibrant cultural streams that speak to who we are as people who have been born and bred in Trinidad and Tobago, post-emancipation, maybe even pre-emancipation. So I look at the panorama, right? The panorama is a competition, yes. It's been going on now for several decades. And in year after year of arrangers and composers creating music for the Panorama competition, we have started to see people developing what is known about the voice of the steel pan itself, the instrument, which has a voice unlike the violin, a voice unlike the guitar, a voice unlike the piano. And for me, this is an empowering thing because it says that we are creating a sound that is based on who we are as people who have been born and bred here in Trinidad and Tobago, whether we are of African descent, Indian descent, European descent, Asian descent. And this is exciting to me. And one of the things that I try to do is to teach people to view the compositional changes that happen in the music and ask questions like, why does that subito piano and crescendo, why is it important? Why is it so popular? Where does that come from in history? And what are the philosophical underpinnings of somebody suddenly stopping the sound? And I know this sounds very technical, and for me, it's very subtle, but I see a lot of hope for the future in the way that we are taking our own music, exploring it in ways that nobody else in the world can do, and nobody else in the world has ever done. And it is important to us because we are Trinidadians, we are Tobagonians, and this music is born out of the struggle, the fight that Professor Springer talked about, the fight of our people over centuries to find their voice and to have their voice and to say, this is who we are and we're not ashamed of it. And you should not try to make a law to stop us from drumming. You should not try to make a law to stop us from speaking the way that we speak. And this is what we see. This is what I see as a musician who studies the music, who studies the history of the music of Trinidad and Tobago and where it fits in the world. This is what I see when I look at the way that music in Trinidad and Tobago has developed. Now I could go on, but I know we're limited for time. So Keela, I'm going to turn over to you again.
If I can pull the strands together so far, and what is interesting to me is both Entu's reaction and Dr. Samaru's reaction, and it's coming from two different ends of the work we need to do. We have been doing the historical work. That historical work has been archived and shelved because there's this artificial barrier between academia and the rest of the population. And I think having a panel like this is an opportunity for us to bridge that gap. The things I would have known, and there are levels of inequality that lead to this gap in the first place. I make no bones, I went to a prestige school. And when I start talking about the things I learned in history in my prestige school, colleagues who went to government schools or other schools like, we never heard that, we didn't learn that. All we did was medieval history and that was it. And it's like, so you've never read about Mayans, you didn't read about Haitian Revolution, you didn't read these things, but we got these things in our school. And it speaks to a larger issue of what I call the failed education revolution. Because as you mentioned, Dr. Samaru, we were ushered into independence by a historian who wrote a very different perspective on history. He was one of the first people to actually talk about economics leading to emancipation. And there was an attempt to revolutionize our education system. And for people like in Cambon's generation, it was starting to turn and then it stopped. And we have not revisited that. And I want to applaud you all for doing the kind of work you do in bridging this gap. The historians document, I'm going to call you Dr. Springer because you have an honorary doctorate and people I like to throw out titles. And Dr. Springer, you
Don't forget his honorary doctorate from UTT.
Yes. And I applaud you for dramatizing this history because that's one way of bringing it forward. I applaud you, Dr. Henry, for bringing the music and having that incubating that critical thinking of why we are here, why we do what we do now. And it brings me, and we kind of started talking about this. There's another misconception that the revolution, if we acknowledge that there was a revolutionary underpinning for emancipation in the Caribbean, we kind of don't make the linkages. But Dr. Springer, you started making those linkages when you talked about pre and post emancipation revolutions. And when Professor Imber talked about the Black Lives Matter now, it is a natural extension of our revolutionary process. We were not sitting idly by and taking blows. We actively participated in liberating ourselves to varying degrees. I have notes here saying that we need to talk about the successes as much and celebrate. And I want to celebrate the work of the Dr. Samaroos and the work of the Dr. Springers and the work of Kafra Kamban and the work of Dr. Henry as successes in terms of bringing this idea of the revolutionary emancipatory spirit into the public domain. So thank you so much. I will count you all as successes in this regard because you all are doing the work.
But can I come back in because I want to deal with something that Brinsley said and that Dr. Henry said. Brinsley, I know that you and Ken Parmasad were different kinds of historians who were involved. But there is, as Keela said, that gap with the scholastic thing of these tomes on the shelves, not even reaching the education system. Professor Imber spoke about the role of Christianity. My granddaughter in secondary school was given as her question the thing that you have to SBA. How did Christianity contribute to emancipation? So I wrote a long list of sources from the historians which dispute and show the real role of Christianity, even some snatches of poetry from the poets of the area. And the teacher never responded and did not give the child the mark that I think that she should have had. So there is this serious divide. In the 70s, from the 70s to 75, 76, we went on the back steps in all the plannings and so, members of NJAC, with Rodney, with Samaru, with CLR James, and so on, and communicated with our young people because there was writing in a way that we could share and make relevant. And you know, and as Brinsley said, the thing that history is not being taught, and when it is taught, I mean, my granddaughter also in a social studies experiment was told by a teacher that she is a Negro, and the child came home traumatized because that is the one cuss word in my house. Okay, and I want to say a word about the music. The pan has its special sound, but the pan is a national instrument. It belongs to all people, but it comes from the belly of the African, and we must not pretend that that is not so. And it is an instrument of revolution, because when the drum was banned again in 1884, after the 1881 riots, we as an instrument, as an act of revolution, went into our ancestral memory and created a sound. And that pan was nurtured in all the Orisha yards in Trinidad and Tobago, in Tacarigua, in Belmont, in Port of Spain. So it is an instrument of rebellion that comes from the African belly, which we have shared with the entire contribution as a national instrument. The other thing I want to say about that pan. So if you're looking at Labanty and Caranage and all these places that, and you're looking at reconstruction of the society, you can't have a committee without a pan man on it, without somebody who understands pan and the role that it has played coming out of the belly of resistance. To me, it's not so hard, because for every panorama, which is the biggest musical event in the country, why we can't have a pan theater on top the hill where everybody have to go and pay reverence to the pan? Brian Serra designed a pan theater since God make morning, since Adam was a little boy in short pants. I don't know that nothing has come of that. The last point I want to make about the pan is that in my cosmology, in my understanding of African spirituality, the pan is the creation, the gift of Ogun. And Ogun is the warrior man who fights first. But Ogun is also the father of creativity. Ogun is also the owner of the house of money. So what you want more than that? You have money, you have creativity, and you have warriorhood. And if we are to look at the pan for what it really is, we will solve a lot of the problems of sense of self, of economy for our people, all these things. But I get very passionate. So
Can I just well, I see Mr. Campbell wants to speak. So
go ahead. I'll respond to N2 after you speak. Yes.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to reiterate that the perspective that I'm taking comes purely from what's happening in the music, right? If you go from do to re, that interests me, because why you go from do to re and not do to me? Okay, there's a logic behind every choice that a composer makes. And Professor Springer, to achieve what you're talking about, the thing that we have to add to that is, what is the repertoire that these instruments are going to play? Right now, we have an instrument with no music. And why I say that is because what does the pan play? We take a song that has been created for another instrument and we do an interpretation of that song. And that's what panorama is. What we need is music of the pan for the pan, where the pan plays its own voice, it sings its own song, and it's not dependent on a pre-existing song from somewhere else to find its meaning. And that's a place where we have room for growth, right? The panorama is fantastic, and I'm not saying no, right? We have learned a lot about how the pan makes its music by exploring music through arrangements of pre-existing songs. So now, where are the songs that were made specifically for the pan with no reference to words? That music has a place too, and it has a future if it does not already have a present. And that's what when I challenge the young musicians at the Academy for the Performing Arts, it is always to say, what new? I took a course in creative writing somewhere back in the mists of time, where Earl Lovelace was the instructor. And I wrote this story that I thought was good. And he said, it's a good story, but what does it mean? And that question haunts me, because that was the only comment he ever made. And I ask that question all the time. Yes, that's a good arrangement, but what does it mean? Where is it? How do you use the voice of the pan? And you see, for me, when you think about what emancipation is, it is an evolving story. It's not just the one thing that happened, but it is a mindset that we continue to carry forward in the way that we express ourselves. And part of expressing ourselves is allowing ourselves to see the voice that we have. And I think that is the contribution that pan brings to the emancipation story. is that the Pan is teaching us that there is a voice that has yet not come into its own. And that is a voice of the Pan as an instrument that makes its own song, not relying on pre-existing calypsos always, or pre-existing pieces, or reinterpretations of Western classical pieces. To me, that has been part of the venerated history of the development of Pan. And now we need to take the Pan beyond that. And to me, it's a simple thing. We just need to broaden our minds a little bit and accept what is in front of our faces. You know, this potential is there. Let's now train up a class of people, composers, who are brave enough and daring enough to make that music, because that is music that is essentially Trinidadian, because of where it starts. It starts in the belly of this music that comes from the Pan.
May I, once people start to talk about Pan, it will raise me. I can take issue with several things that were said there. Serious issue, both by N2, with all due respect, and by Henry. But this is not the time for that. But I will remember what you all said, and I will challenge you at some point. Don't worry. Both of
Forward to that.
I look forward to it too.
I will take the opportunity to respond to what, well, not directly respond to what N2 said as such, but what she said raises, some important issues. And both N2 and Dr. Samaru, who was one of my teachers, and I should tell Dr. Samaru something, is that sometime after I was out of the university, a student who came to interview me expressed his great horror that there were a number of students in Dr. Samaru's class who didn't like Dr. Samaru too much. And why didn't they like Dr. Samaru? Because they found that instead of teaching them what is in the book, he was going outside the book to talk about all kinds of things, which are very relevant, but which they couldn't see as relevant. So that the student who is reaching the university now is a very different person to the student who reached the university in the 1960s and had a keenness about rare learning and information. So I just make that point because the education system from top to bottom now is not functioning in a way to liberate our minds. It is functioning in a way to enslave our minds. And that is a serious challenge to us in the education system. In relation to N2, I think N2 has found a fantastic formula where she's able to incorporate the knowledge within the art. And that is something very important in communication. In the Emancipation Support Committee, this is an area in which we put a lot of emphasis, and a lot of emphasis in the schools. So for the schools, we have designed what we call a African History Caravan. It's not just about our history in the Caribbean, because if we just deal with ourselves in the Caribbean, we don't really get a sense of who we are as an African people. And therefore, we take the history from the continent, come right through to the Caribbean and other parts of the diaspora and everything else. And we have created this African History Caravan, it is very visual. It's just that it's a large exhibition to move. So sometimes a school may request, but if they can't send the transport for it, we can't always afford the transport to take it to the school. But it's been to a lot of schools. And along with that, we use carnival characters as part of how we educate people. So we get a midnight robber, or some other carnival character, Peregrinade, and that sort of thing, to come and provide information in that form. So we had to find all kinds of forms of teaching about ourselves and our history. We also have the lectures. A number of schools invite us for lectures, especially and we go around and, we have a number of people who go out to the various schools because it is a real fight to get any positive information on African people, not just the history, but positive information on Africans into the education system. After the Black Power movement of 1970, one of the responses of the government was to have these symposia on the education system. And a number of the young people who had been influenced by the Black Power movement and were students still in secondary schools and whatnot, asked to have their voice at these sessions the government was having. And they all recommended for African history to be on the curriculum. And here it is 50 years later. It's not there yet in those primary schools because it is disturbing when somebody goes to talk in a primary school and to them Columbus is still a hero and they can't call any of the people who fought for our freedom. They don't know those names at all. So that is really a problem and a lot of work has to be done about it. One of the other things that we are involved in, apart from is the African History Quiz, which we have every year in the secondary schools. In any part of Trinidad and Tobago, any school that requests it, and we ask schools, we want your students to be part of the quiz. One of the sad things for us is that a number of schools don't participate. Why? Because it needs at least one teacher from the school who will decide to work with the children, maybe give up a Saturday morning here and there to help them prepare for the quiz. And so many schools with all these African teachers, and it is so hard to get one of them interested enough so that even where the students want to participate, and an even worse example came up in the last year's history quiz. A school that won it about 3 times, because we've been having it for a number of years, and was so eager to participate again. And the teacher who was teaching, who used to give them the time, was actually an Indian teacher. And he was transferred to another school. And there was no teacher in that school of mainly African children who was prepared to give up a couple Saturdays in order to prepare them for the history quiz. So we are really faced with an immense challenge. The formal education system is totally rejecting the idea of African history being part of the primary school curriculum. What happened at the university would be a different story. And even when you try to do things in the informal routes that are open to us, you are still facing the challenge because of how deep-rooted that negative attitude towards our history is, and that is so critical. And we face with one of the most worrying things. I always tell people, when people talk about a bad 4-letter word, they have a particular thing in mind. I have something in mind too. It is called STEM. That's a 4-letter word. And I have nothing against science. I have nothing against technology and all of that. But I think they are very critical and should be critical parts of the curriculum. But there is a trust from the Western world now to make that the whole of education. And in fact, 2 years ago when I was in a conference in Ghana, and one of the things that came up in that conference is that you had professors and so from the United States going to these universities in Africa, and not only the professors, but the people who represent financial interests, and promising a lot of money for universities. But a condition for providing that money is that they must go STEM, so that it is a conscious effort to continue to control the minds of our people. And emancipation, if it means anything, means liberating the minds. That's what I have to say for now.
Again, could I jump in here as an engineer, as a proponent? The issue is not STEM as opposed to African history. Let me give you a story. TTIT, Trinidad Institute of Technology, which didn't exist for a very long time. It existed at the end of about 20 years ago, and it was subsumed into UDT when UDT came into existence. They did a engineering degree from the University of Houston, and I was one of the people from UWI who was asked to assist in evaluating the degree and this and that and the other. And when I looked at the curriculum, it was very interesting that a degree in engineering had a compulsory course called the History of Texas. So these guys in Trinidad and Tobago who were doing that degree had to do the history of Texas because Houston, of course, is in Texas. So the issue is that not that we cannot, with all due respect, Kafra, we cannot not go into STEM. That's the future. However, it must not be at the expense of other subjects, whether and African history, of course, for Africans and other people is very important. Music is something that many people advocate that is very important, but we are talking now about African history. Let me just say that Dr. Rowley, early in his term, started a process. He established a committee. And that committee, Andrew Springer was one of the authors of a book. Now, I don't know how successful that book has been in terms of its compulsory introduction to schools. It's a big book. I thought it was too big. It should be much smaller and should concentrate much more again on the history. Maybe Ento could speak a little bit about that attempt by Dr. Rowley to are you hearing me? I seem to have lost something.
I think it was an excellent initiative. And I believe that the book is an excellent book. I think what has happened is that the production of the book has been seen as an end in itself by the Ministry of Education. And there's been no interest in following it up, making sure that it is dispersed into schools, and there's no instruction from the Ministry of Education that principals and teachers look into this work and transpose what in it is. The same thing that Brinzy was talking about taking this stuff, because I think the book itself is an excellent book. The idea by Dr. Rowley was an excellent one, and it has not been followed through in the way I think that it was, that he intended. But, you know, I think that we have real problems in our Ministry of Education, and let me just say that I think we have real problems in our Ministry of Education with having vision, with carrying out things, with making an impact. I think that book could have been the beginning of a revolutionary process in the Ministry of Education that was not followed up. And in terms of that Ministry of Education, I mean, there are serious, serious things. At one time, as artists, people like myself, Brother Resistance, storytellers and artists were able to go into the schools and make that link between the formal history and use storytelling, music, and all of that. And we had very, very successful programs. A certain minister of education came in and he banned all those things. The first thing that he did was to ban the artists and so from going into these schools in Movan, Laventille, and so on, where the programs were being asked for. I mean, there are all the letters and everything there. I think it was a deliberate racist act, and it was very, very terrible. But with this Minister of Education, we have made several requests, had several meetings to ask for us as artists to go back into the schools and use that information that is on the shelves there, and through song, through dramatization and all of that, to have a non-didactic way of introducing children to their history, to their sense of self and all of that. But it has not been taken up by the ministry.
You know, one of the things that I would like to see, and I've been, really harassing Claudius Fergus about it, we should continue to write that book that the ministry did, and you say it's not being circulated. That's very unfortunate. But that does not mean that we should not continue the writing. That's point one. And in doing that writing, in sort of developing, the whole African memory and the tremendous contributions since slavery and afterwards, we should continue writing, and we should devise ways of getting these things out to schools and to organizations all over Trinidad and Tobago outside of the ministry. That is an important task. So I don't know if somebody who is listening, and I mean, I've harassed Fergus so often that I think, no, he's a little fed up with me. He said, look, don't tell me about that book again. But he's doing nothing. And I'm so keen that a book should be done showing the whole panorama of African civilization in the Americas, the large number of things, plants, large number of plants that came with the slaves and afterwards from Africa. We must talk about people like Elmer Francois. We talk about Butler, and we talk about Renzi in 1937. We don't talk about the person who organized the resistance in Port of Spain and who prevented the sending of a trainload of ammunition to shoot the people down there. It was Elmer Francois. But we don't study her. We don't know. If ever a statue should be done for anybody, it should be done for Elmer Francois, because she was as important as Butler and Renzi, and I'm arguing that very strongly, in the creation of the revolution that took place here in 1937. But who knows about her? Rhoda Reddock, yes, but after Rhoda has written, who knows? So I'm just suggesting very strongly, and I hope people like Afra will take it on, that we prepare a volume now that looks after the music, the cultural expressions, the plants and other things that are brought from Africa, which are so enriched the Caribbean. And I think in that way, one would be creating a kind of cultural confidence among people of African origin. I mean, the Indians are doing it extensively. There's going to be an international conference on the Indian diaspora in the month of August. So that work is going on. Nevertheless, despite the absence of formal state support. And I don't understand, I can't understand why it is that African people are not taking this initiative to just get together. The material that I said at the beginning is there. You don't have to do too much new work. Bring it out in an attractive form. And I can tell you there would be people who would be prepared to sponsor a book like that, organizations and so on. And so I don't see the problem. And I think one of the things that I would like to see coming out of this discussion is an initiative in providing more literature relating to the Black presence in the Caribbean.
I'd like to thank you also for the conversation, and we have already touched on two of the points that we wanted to bring up in this discussion. One, the role of art, music, culture, masquerade, everything that we do in terms as a form of rebellion and also as a decolonizing force. And we started to talk about that a little bit with the work that y'all did in schools, taking the artists in and dramatizing that history so that they get a better sense of selves. And it's something that we need to continue. Um, and also in the conversation, and as Dr. Samaru, you're questioning why don't we? And there's a peculiar point that always struck me when we were looking at the March to Independence, and is the idea of the ideology of nationalism and how that ideology shaped how we view ethnicity in a multi-ethnic society. And we know the famous speech, forget Mother Africa, forget Mother India, there's only Mother Trinidad. And of the people in Trinidad, and I suppose because we were already suffering from low self-esteem from years of hegemony, the main ethnicity that latched onto that idea happened to be Black people, happened to be African. And now there's a serious pushback in terms of identifying anything as African and it also being Trinidadian. And I think that's one of the problems that we encounter when we start talking about African history or African retentions, African culture in Trinidad. So all of a sudden, and coming out of my experience, for example, in teaching in the Masters of Arts and Carnival Studies, the minute I tell people, oh yes, yeah, Carnival, is African, I've actually had people tell me it can't be because, it was developed in Trinidad. I was like, those aren't two different things. Um, it is also not exclusive or exclusionary to say that it's spawned from a specific ethnicity. Like when you talk about Pan, um, and Pan's patron Orisha being Ogun, is not exclusionary. It's not stagnant. It's shaping and it's moving forward. And I think that's the last question I actually want to bring up, this idea of how do we reconcile the nationalism, and to explain a little bit, but y'all could explain more. Nationalism is the idea that there's a monolithic national culture. So expressions that might be a little more ethnic than some, we eschew for a homogenous national identity. How do we reconcile that with ethnic awareness, ethnic pride, our multiculturalness, and moving forward with a true sense of ourselves in a multi-ethnic society as Trinidadians, as African descended?
Well, to me, there's no dichotomy. We have many facets of ourselves. Your nationality is one thing, but your ethnicity is something else. For me, I don't understand the confusion. I am an African. That is my race, that is my ethnicity, and my nationality is Trinbagonian. I don't have any conflict with that. And I totally object to the notion that we have inculcated of this rainbow nation thing. For me, to have no black in the rainbow, it can have no black in the rainbow. And I think that if we want to really create a nation, when we sit at our national table, each must be proud, each must be whole in its own self, and stretch the hand across in mutual respect. Why, for instance, in schools, okay, all the schools have what is a Christian prayer. Why don't we have a mantra? Why don't we have a chant? Why don't we explore our similarities and celebrate our differences? I don't I don't see a problem with that. We have absorbed the foolishness of no mother Africa, no mother India, because as much as I have respect for the father of the nation, that was foolishness. And we need to look again at that. And it is my feeling that I have seen no government really explore the possibilities of uniting our people, what I have called harmony in diversity, recognizing and praising the diversity and getting together on the basis of celebrating our similarities and celebrating and understanding our differences. That is who we are.
Yeah, let me say that it is very important that each one of our ethnicities should find out more about itself
So,
so that there's an enormous amount of self-confidence. Unless you are confident about yourself and where you are and where you stand, then you don't have the strength, you don't have the gravitas to go and deal with others because you're not sufficiently confident in your own self, in your own ancestry, in how you have developed the civilization. And that is why it is very important that, as I say, in the case of the Black population, there should be more of this rooting into the ancestry in Africa and the ancestry in the Caribbean. So you create a solid, confident person who would then be in a position to dialogue with others on a basis of equality.
Could I let me throw a little curveball, as they say in America. You remember the mighty Douglas? He beat Sparrow with Lazy Man and split me in two. The mighty Douglas from Sama was a Douglas, an exact Douglas. How do we deal with that issue when we talk about going back? How do we deal with somebody like me? My grandmother was what they used to call a Carib, different name now, from St. Lucia. My grandfather on my mother's side was French, so he was Caucasian. My grandfather on my father's side was a straight mulatto. And if you look at my brother Dennis, you will see exactly where that mulatto man came back, my full brother Dennis. How do you deal with the mighty Douglas, some other people in Trinidad and Tobago, and people like me? How do we deal
Yeah,
with that?
there's really no contradiction. Let's say in your case, you have First People's ancestry. You look at that is an important.
Listen, my great great grandmother, by the way, came from Quebec. She was a Mohawk.
Right.
So,
Okay. So that's First Nations.
yeah.
So, I mean, in the case of someone like you and others like you, should be looking at all those ancestries and see how they have combined to make you into the Caribbean, the West Indian.
Which I have.
Similarly, for people who are Douglas, they should understand the Indian part of them, they should understand the African part of them, because a lot of the Douglas in the society are very schizoid. They don't know which side to lean on. And I'm saying that they have to lean on both sides to understand themselves. So for a Douglas, an understanding of Indian culture and of African culture is important to create a total self, And in the case of the Indian or the African, not the Douglas, they go back into their ancestries, looking at as I said, the biogenetic memories that we bring down from the ancestors to understand oneself.
If I can just add something here, I just wanted to bring the point. I am very impatient to see Trinidad and Tobago kind of see itself. To me, ethnicity is about a sense of shared culture and traditions. And we have a shared culture and tradition. We have many streams of shared culture and traditions here in Trinidad and Tobago, which I don't see us embracing. And we talk a lot about ethnicity, but there is a Trinidadian ethnicity. And I see it, I've talked about the panorama, but I also see it in something like Best Village, We have 50 plus years of tradition of folk theater in the Best Village competition, again, another competition. And an archive of issues of community and priorities of life for people living in Trinidad and Tobago going back over half a century. And we do not have we don't have a national archive of these plays. We don't study the themes that those plays have brought forward. We don't study the theatrical techniques that have been developed within Best Village over the past 50 years. Best Village and Panorama are sisters in terms of cultural expression. And we take one and we put it on a stage and we say, this is Trinidadian. And we take the other and we shove it in a drawer and we look down on it. But Best Village is part of the ethnicity of Trinidad and Tobago. And if we are really going to say that we are emancipating our minds, part of that process is to take the things that we have been doing to establish a shared cultural tradition here in Trinidad and Tobago, and say, let us look at that. Let us study that and learn more about who we are. And maybe at some point down the road, monetize that. Because our economy is looking for ways to diversify itself. Let's start with what we have. And so while I am, as somebody who is African descended, right, I have an ancestral heritage that I value, but I also have an ethnicity that is tied to Trinidad and Tobago only and to nowhere else. And I know that might be, people might be dissatisfied with that. But, you know, the first live music I ever heard was pan music. And this is how I think about who I am. There's a music that defines me. There is a type of theater that defines me. There's the panorama. There is the carnival. There's music festival. These are things that are part of what it means to be Trinidadian, part of what it means to be Tobagonian. And I think part of what a university like UTT should be investing itself in is to kind of go back and launch studies of things that we are already doing to express our ethnicity as Trinidadians and as Tobagonians. I think Best Village is a great example of an untapped resource for research, where we learn more about ourselves as a people and a community, and we learn more about the issues that have come to the fore in these communities and have generated discussion and have generated creative output being brought to the stage. I think this is a way forward. I think if we focus our minds too narrowly only on geography and to a certain extent only history, then we are limiting ourselves as far as the possibilities for the future. So I would like to see more direct engagement with the things that we've already been doing, studying those things, archiving them, and as Dr. Salmon said, writing them up so that people can now take these things, put them into school and learn more about Trinidad. Just as Professor Imbe said, you know, the engineers had to go and learn history of Texas. So we need to be, students need to be learning in school the history of the steel pan movement, the history of Best Village, the history of Mastana Bahar. All of these things are expressions of the culture of Trinidad and Tobago. And we need to do more as people of Trinidad and Tobago to focus on these things because 200 years from now, people are going to be wanting information about where we are, right? Africa has a history. India has a history. Europe has a history. Trinidad and Tobago has a history. And all elements of the history of Trinidad and Tobago are there and they're untapped still, because there's a whole stream of cultural development that has been ignored, right? And I think that's part of the path forward. I'm gonna shut up there. I know I start to, Keela, you need to cut me off when I start to go down this road, because you know I could talk till tomorrow morning.
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. It's interesting to play devil's advocate a little bit. It's interesting that the first two cultural expressions you call kind of draw very heavily from African cultural expressions, translated in a Trinidadian way. And I think Dr. Samaru, Dr. Springer, and all of us would agree this is what we mean when we talk about understanding ourselves, our ethnicity, and how our strands contribute to the tapestry that is Trinidadian culture. I would like to share a story since people have been sharing stories. When I was an infant, I had Maljo, and I was after some denial because my mother was Western educated and those things not supposed to exist anymore. She finally took me to a pundit, and as the pundit was treating me, he kept saying, Africans have their way too. We have our way. You have your way. Don't forget. And for me, that is the epitome of living in a multi ethnic society. I have my way. You have your way. We can arrive at the same solution by applying whichever way works best. And I think learning about our African ancestry, our ethnicity within our nationality is one of the ways we get to diversify our economy, one of the ways we get to stabilize our society. We didn't talk too much about the Black Power movement and how, I mean, not Black Power, sorry, the Black Lives movement and how it's affecting us here. But it is one of the impetuses, this idea of how do I identify within my as a Trinidadian, but also as someone of African descent. Um, I used to joke with people when I was studying abroad. It's like in Trinidad I'm Black, in America I'm Afro Trinidadian. It's a difference because there is a different Trinidadian culture, a different expression of Blackness, but we do not necessarily talk about what that Blackness is. And I'm going to turn over to the questions we've been collecting, but I want to first end with a comment, then invite you all to, if you want to do some kind of summation before we go to question and answer. I have noticed, paying attention in the field I teach and whatnot, that there is this idea that we are default Trinidadian, right? And I'm going to tease you, Dr. Henry, because Dr. Henry, you're in a suit and tie. And the idea of respectability still in Trinidad is a very Eurocentric idea of the suit and tie. When we watch people in parliament, they're in a suit and tie. Why can't they be in an abada? Why can't they be in jodhpurs? Why can't they be in saris and shalwas and kuftis, etc., etc.? These are the dressed up ethnic wear. But we assume that a suit and tie is not ethnic wear, and it is. And I think during the discussion we're having now, these are some of the strands, the threads, the underlying issues for what we've been discussing that we turn a blind eye to. And as you say, Dr. Samaru, when we get a full understanding of our history, our ancestry, our ethnicity, and what it means to be in this space, we would have a more liberated society and we would be moving one step further in our quest for true emancipation. And I want to invite you now as the panel to, share your last thoughts. It could be summarize all that we've been discussing. What are your takeaways? And also, if you can highlight successes that you want people to know about, and successes in terms of people who have been working towards societal emancipation, who have achieved some measure of success, not necessarily measured in a capitalist way, but success in terms of moving this struggle, this revolution forward.
I think Brinsley said some words that are critical, and they are cultural confidence. As African people, And I describe myself as African, not African derived, not of African ancestry. I am African. Malcolm said, a cat born in an oven does create kittens. Malcolm X said that. The thing of cultural confidence is critical. We have created PAN, we have created Kaiso, we have created Best Village if you want, but that is a whole next panel to deal with, because I didn't even want to start to go there, because I have some experiences of Best Village that will make your hair curl. Cultural confidence is key. For all we have created, the PAN, the Kaiso, and all that, it has not catapulted us into having the cultural confidence to let us have our role in the society that we should have. 1970 brought a lot of gains to a lot of people. But I think it was Brinsley who talked about people would be willing to fund certain things. We have not found that to be true. Africans who have benefited from the work that we did in 70 would not spend a penny on any cultural form. Kafra could give you endless stories about that. All right? So while we have created things and done things in the context of the poor education system, in the context of the fact that there are no memorials to who we are, there are no place names, we are not celebrated in the education system, in the history, so that all we have done, all those things have not given us the cultural confidence to erode the lack of sense of self and all of that. That was the legacy of enslavement. It's true we have done a lot. True we have done a lot. But the African contribution needs to be celebrated by the state, by the education system, by our university, our carnival. I mean, the biggest thing that we have done, our biggest festival, is going west into the same communities that criticize it and abuse it. The people from East Dry River, from whose belly the carnival came, can't even sell us snow cone. You know, there are inequalities and injustices. We have a Chinese quarter in the midst of East Dry River. I mean, what an anomaly, what an insult. Who celebrates the African? At what level and where? And if that does not happen, there will continue to be discontent. There will continue to be, because if a people feel alienated in their own society, all that aliens will do is destroy. And we have to reverse that. We have to pay attention to the communities that Africans created. Africans were given no land after enslavement. And we have created and we have survived. It is time for us to be celebrated in a real way in this society.
Well, let me just add to what Onto has said by saying that Africans should get out of the whole philosophy of victimology, oppressed and this and that and the other, and move into a philosophy of triumphalism. And I think that triumphalism can be very easily proven because of the enormity of the African achievement. I just want to repeat that Africans should get out of the whole syndrome of victimology and move into one of a very demonstrable triumphalism. That's point one. And I'll just tickle you a little bit by saying that, you know, African people, you say don't support publications and so on. But there are other people, and organizations internationally would provide money for such ventures. So we should not be despondent. And I'll just repeat something that I said earlier on, that there should be a whole spate of publications with in all the various dimensions of African triumphalism in the Caribbean. And we should not depend on the government, on the state, because if you depend, you'll be depending on them ad infinitum. I don't think they would move. For them, science and business studies and so on are really far more important than history or sociology or that kind of study. So I think, as I said, we should move into an attitude of triumphalism and then to demonstrate that to the larger national community.
Kila and everyone, I'll say this. The music we call parang is derived from a genre that came to the New World back in the 1400s, right? It's still around today, and people in Trinidad and Tobago have taken it and made it our own music. And so since you brought up my suit, let me tell you about this suit. This suit was made for me, paid for by my father, and made by an elderly gentleman in Laramine. I don't know his name. His name was Mr. Otley. And he was a tailor. And he was an excellent tailor. I still have the suit. Whenever I wear this suit, I think of my father and his legacy. I think of that old man who made suits, I am told, for everybody in Trinidad and Tobago, right? But he was a simple old craftsman who lived a simple life in his house in Laramine. And he was friends with my father, and he made this suit for me, right? So whenever I wear this suit and I go anywhere, people say, hey, that's a nice suit. And I know, I say, thank you. I know I look damn good in it. And it was made by a Trinidadian tailor. And for me, that is part of being Trinidadian too. Not just because the suit is a European construct. That doesn't mean that it can't be part of the heritage that we call our own, right? So that's all I wanted to respond to. And I think that I want to wrap up what I have been saying all night by talking about it from that point of view, that we decide the voice that we use, and we use the elements that exist around us in our environment, and we define our ethnicity from those elements.
May I, Dr. Henry, you saw Muhammad Ali in anything else but a suit?
Professor Mbe, I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Have you ever seen Muhammad Ali in anything else but a suit? Have you ever seen Martin Luther King in any other thing but a suit? You are quite right. We have to take the best of what exists in the world. And if a suit is, I don't wear suits, if you notice it. I don't wear suits. But that is me. But I admire people who look nice in a suit, and I looking nice in a suit. If I were you, I would have skipped that and apologize for a suit. I don't think anybody has to apologize for if they're wearing a suit or whatever. So that's me on that. Anyway, Kafra, you were going to say something. Sorry.
Yes. I will just say something brief on this question of identity when you bring it down to that personal level, as Dr. Henry has done that. Because I think that if someone is only Trinidadian, because, then it means that their history began, and unless they're indigenous, it means that person's history began because the earliest Trinidadian ancestors from that would be coming off of the slave ship, unless they're indigenous. I don't know, have we come to an end or something? I'm just seeing
No.
have you heard?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right, that's the wrap-up signal. Yeah, so I think that we are really cutting ourselves off, because if I just define myself as Trinidadian, what about all the history that my ancestors had on the continent of Africa. All the culture, the technology, everything else they developed. Do I discard that and begin with coming off of the slave ship? You know, we lack depth in our identity if we cut ourselves off from our ancestral identities. And we are living in a world where there's hardly any group of people who cut themselves off from that ancestral identity. And it makes them stronger for recognizing it. So the white man in the United States, you know, he sees himself still in terms of his European identity. To him, white equals European, even though he's American by nationality. So he said, I am an American, I'm a proud American. But look at the kinds of alliances that he forms outside of the United States. Look at how his family traces their history. Now, we may not be able to go to records as individuals and trace our history to Africa, but Dr. Henry, your appearance and mine tell me that we come from the same space historically. And if we cut off that part of our identity, what is left? Because the identity here teaches us that we are inferior people. That is why our children grow up with a sense of, a lack of a sense of self. Because in their minds, when you cut off the knowledge of where you came from, the real knowledge of where you came from, what you are left with is the impressions that you get from the television, from the books you read, which don't teach you anything positive about the history of your ancestors and all that. Whereas everybody else in the society, who are just as Trinidadian as you and I, because I'm Trinidadian by nationality, everybody else who is Trinidadian, you will see they have a very proud sense of themselves because they believe that they came from something that goes back tens of thousands of years. And there's a tradition to hold on to and to be proud of. So I will not make my mind shallow just to have a Trinidadian identity. That is my nationality. Only one part of my identity.
Please allow me to respond. I have not said that we should cut off our historical and ancestral lines. But I have a friend who says all the time, in order to get to San Fernando, you have to know that you are in Port of Spain. And it's a great metaphor for knowing where you are. And I sense that there is sometimes an overemphasis on where we have all come from to the detriment of studying where we are. And this is why I have brought up the development of Panorama in its place and the development of Best Village in its place, because I feel that there is a dearth of awareness and study of where we are. And I think that that's something that could be corrected. So I'm not saying swing the pendulum all the way to the other side, but I think that there is room for us to balance that out a little bit better than it has been in conversations that have been going on in this country for the past several decades.
Dr. Henry, let me apologize. I didn't know Picton in your suit would lead to.
Listen, don't pick on the suit, right?
But apart from,
I tell you, leave the suit alone.
what the point about the suit?
Malcolm makes you to wear a suit. Leave the suit alone.
Not that specifically you're wearing a suit, but the idea that wearing a suit is the only means of showing respectability. If you want to wear a suit, wear a suit. If you want to wear an agbada, wear an agbada. If you want to wear a sari, wear a sari. If you want to wear jodhpurs, wear jodhpurs. The idea,
but it's personal, right?
Huh?
Personal and individual to each person.
Personal.
There we go.
But what I think the panel has been talking about is that there is a zeitgeist, a societal pressure that is not a personal choice that we can make, right? When, for example, going to one of the extempo exhibitions for Bocas Lit Festival, I think it was I can't keep track of time in 2020. 2020 is about 20 years long at this point. So I think it was last year or year before. And I was wearing an African print skirt. Another woman was wearing a dashiki. And this was me. And the Calypsonian says, what you're wearing a dashiki for is not emancipation. And so the idea that you can be expressive as an individual, acknowledging ethnicity as you feel, that is not so accepted society-wide. So apart from the individual reaction, talking, looking more as a culture with a common sea perspective on these expressions. But and I thank you so much for the conversation. I want to turn to some of the questions that we have been receiving. This one is for Dr. Cambon, from Dr. Brown, who is also teaching in, I'm going to forget her exact title, so I'm going to just say, she teaches at UTT in APA, in the music department as well.
Voice.
Professor of music.
Voice.
Professor of music, yes. What do you think we as a university, UTT, can do to disseminate this important information as Professor Samru has suggested? And would a humanities course for all students help to address the knowledge deficit that the students may bring from secondary school? Would student participation in cultural events be more effective? I will throw this out to she addressed it to you, Dr. Campbell, but I will also throw it out to the entire panel.
Oh, okay, well, I don't know enough about the UTT curriculum, but I would say that in a society like this, the curriculum of every educational institution, including the UTT, and it is whether the student is doing science or anything else, there should be an aspect of the curriculum that helps to give each group, each student who comes into the institution, a sense of who he or she is, not just in terms of chopped off part of their history in Trinidad and Tobago, but in terms of the ancestral identity as well, so that whether I go into that school as an Indian or as an African or whatever it might be, I should be able to learn enough of myself to make me a confident human being. And that is what I say, that every curriculum in Trinidad and Tobago ought to do, unless it is a school that caters to only children of a particular ethnicity. And even so, I feel that they need to understand the heritage of the other people who live in the society. Because my heritage is mine, I embrace it emotionally. I want to get more knowledge about it, but I also think I need to be knowledgeable about the heritage of the other people with whom I share this society. So that's what I would say on curriculum, because I don't know the specifics that I'm dealing with the UTT curriculum.
Maybe I can come in here. At UE, and most of the faculties, they tend not to have it in what I call the professional faculties, because they say it's already too crowded. I don't agree with that, but at UE, the people who are in the humanities and so on, they have 3 what I call university courses. These courses, one has to deal with language because of the deficiency we have found. And this goes back a long time in language in the schools, English particularly. One has to do with, we believe that everybody should be educated a bit about science, basic. And one has to do with history, Caribbean history and so. And those are compulsory things. I really don't know how strong the ancestral history, as it were, of Caribbean peoples go back, like from India and Africa and so on, particularly the 2 major groups. But I agree with you. You remember I gave you the story that the degree from the University of Houston had a compulsory course, the history of Texas. There's no reason why, because of this lack of self and particularly I would say among the African population, that we should have it in all. It wouldn't hurt to have it in all the programs in the universities in the Caribbean. The University, as I say, of the West Indies has it for most of the faculties. UDD does not have it, and I was noting that lack as I was going along when we first started talking about how the history can be disseminated. And it's not just the elementary schools, or my age is saying elementary, primary schools and secondary schools, but it will be reinforced in the university in my view. And it is something that I will take to the university people with respect to that.
One of the things that makes it most critical, that element of heritage and history, that makes it most critical for the African, is that the group that is subjected through media and through even what they get in the formal education system, the group that is subjected to the most negative images of itself are the Africans, because you get it from almost everything, right? If I take my own upbringing, and unfortunately, I don't think it has changed that much now, but what did I learn? What did I see of myself, right? The first things that come across my consciousness about Africa is from phantom comic strips. A white man in Africa who has all this amount of control over the other people he meets on the continent of Africa. I get it from Tarzan. No, you may say these are just comic strips, but there is no counter to that in my education system. And I go to the movies and I see the same thing. I see this hero Tarzan swinging on the vines, and every white man who goes to Africa becomes king of the jungle, king of the apes, and all of that. And these things are deep psychologically. And if nothing in my life counters those things, even though I forget I ever read Tarzan and forget I ever saw him on the screen or anything, that is part of my psychological makeup. So these are things that we have to attend to the heritage of people in a very systematic way. Give them a sense of their history, something that can make them proud of themselves, because there are so many images of the society, images of who is beautiful and whatnot. I mean, our society passed through a stage when only white people could be so-called beauty queens. And I don't go to beauty contests. I have no interest in them. But the thing is that is what we see as beauty, right? So I remember, which was song the calypso? Was it Christo celebrated Miss Sweden as the queen of the universe? And so we are subjected, especially Africans, because you see the Indian community, even though there were cultural pressures put on the Indian community, but you still have a lot of institutions that have survived. So no matter what the formal education system does, there is a vast informal education within the communities that is some counter to that. But my African children are not exposed to any counter except when somebody like N2 or so goes into the schools. And this is not adequate. So we must ensure that the formal education understands that there are people who are African in this society, and that something needs to be done about that. I went to do a class with students in a school up in Laventille. And when I went into the classroom, and one thing I say, they have a good teacher. You know why? Because there are all kinds of illustrations and images around the classroom, which are good teaching tools. And I know she's a good teacher. Unfortunately, I did not meet her because I'd like to talk to her. Because there's one image with a girl sitting down, and I suspect she's the artist because these are things that didn't come from no magazine or something. This is a drawing and painting. And there's a girl sitting down with a book. And the face of the cover of the book is towards the students. And it says, "Reading makes me beautiful." But do you know what the girl looked like? She had blue eyes and blonde hair. And these are children in a class in Laventille. We are miseducating our children in fundamental ways and not even recognizing it. So if these matters are not addressed as critical matters of concern, because we say we're all Trinidadians, these are the values that we have imbibed as Trinidadians. And if we don't counter those values, we'll always be less than everybody else in this society, despite what we achieve professionally and academically and all of that. So that's what I would say on that issue.
We have one more question, and as we're wrapping up and running out of time, it's also about education. It comes from Dr. Indrani Rampasad. Um, and first, she agrees with you, Dr. Springer, and mentions that if we do not that we need to return the African worldview to the psyche of the nation, and then asks specifically, can we not lobby CXC to make traditional African religions an option for study in the religious education curriculum? Our children study Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam as options for specialization. So why not traditional African spiritualities? Again, throw us out to the panel.
Yeah, well, let me,
That is,
go ahead, go ahead.
that is a very, very, very serious question. I remember a couple of years ago being asked by the Ministry of Culture to be a mentor in that program they had. And as part of my program, I took the children into the First People's Place in Arima, into the Hindu Prachara Kendra, and into an African Ile, place of African spirituality. And most of the young people had never been into any of these places, except for a couple of the youngsters who happened to be Hindu and a couple of the youngsters who happened to be African. But to have that spectrum of so-called pagan religion, non-Christian religion, 1, 2, 3, represented as things of value and important to us as Trinidadians with multicultural heritage. It's a very important thing. The thing of African spirituality is important in this sense of dispossession of the African, because it is through your spirituality that is your worldview. It is through your spirituality that you understand how the world evolves, what is your role in it, what is your view of yourself, your ancestors, and all of that. And the African spirituality, still in this society, is regarded by the worst word possible, the most hated, feared word, obia. And we need to discuss this thing because that word obia comes from obia, the Akan spirituality. And the Akan was the most feared fighters against enslavement in the region. From the 17th to the 19th century, there were revolts right through Suriname, Tobago, Antigua, Jamaica. And that is a whole history of the deliberate deculturalization of the African, the deliberate, I don't want to use the word demonization, but the delegitimization of African spirituality. That is one of the great causes of what is happening. So it is a very, 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 very serious situation in the disrespect that is shown, the fear that even Africans themselves have African spirituality, except like when somebody have Maljo and they go you know, and they go. And I was very interested by that story because my own spiritual mother from Marabella, Yellowisha Melvina Rodney, there was a pundit and there was Yellowisha Melvina Rodney. And when something was wrong, if the pundit was available, you go to the pundit. And if you wanted, you could go to Rodney, and there was no dichotomy. So my sister Indrani, I don't know that I do the Scambule thing every year, and people come and they leave because it has so much to do with African spirituality, and they fret it, and they are upset because some who like the theater and thing, but they get pressure from their family because of this obia thing that this woman have in Kambule, not recognizing that there was no resistance to enslavement that was not rooted in African spirituality. From Bookman and Dessalines, right down to Sandy in Tobago in 1770, who was Akan, and we could. So I mean, we come back to an understanding of the history. If people understood the history of our resistance to enslavement. C.L.R. James says voodoo was the medium of conspiracy. Voodoo has been created as the evilest thing by the media and all of that. So it's the whole thing again of miseducation. Right now we're in the process of trying to create an Ifa Orisha school, and we are hoping like that to try to kind of bring some understanding, some diminution of the fear of African spirituality. But it is critical in terms of coming to know oneself. And that is not to say I want everybody to convert to African spirituality. Although after an understanding of my history, I could not be Christian and African. But that is my choice. But an understanding and have respect for your ancestry, your roots, your origin. So it is a serious question that has to be debated.
I'm getting the signal that we are about out of time. Thank you so much for your contributions. I want to go around the panel and very quickly, one word or not, how far are we? How far do we have to go? If you can sum it up in a sentence, 2 sentences, how far are we? How far do we have to go?
We have had some victories, but we have a long, long way to go. Sense of history, sense of self, focused on tomorrowness, piece of a poet.
Yeah, let me say that, I'm very unhappy with the lack of progress, in that direction. And whereas the Christians and Hindus and the Muslims and so on are doing a lot to conscientize their own followers, this is not being followed so far as African religions are concerned. Even the Islam that is taught, in the secondary school is Indian Islam, when in fact Islam was introduced here by Africans. And there were many schools of African Islam, and African Islam has been a constant bugbear against slavery. They really are against slavery. All of that, we don't know. So I think we have a very long way to go, and the African leaders must be far more aggressive than they have been so far in promoting this other ontology of a very important aspect of civilization.
Since there seems to be silence, let me just quickly say that the education system is really very, very, very critical. The formal education system is really an important tool for turning things around. And it is something that apart from, I mean, we do things by trying to do something in it ourselves, but we need to get the authorities, convince them and put pressure on them to ensure that the education system reflects the kind of knowledge that is important to this society. One, in terms of particular emphasis on the information that could transform the way the African child in this society sees himself or herself, and therefore the African people see themselves. Because that is what is most lacking, because we don't have the kinds of formal institutions that are African oriented, that are helping to change that. And we depend a lot on the formal situation. And that is one of the things that I think is very, very critical. And we also have to try more to influence giving positive information through the formal media, through the mass media in this society. That's what I'd say in conclusion.
I would say we've had some tremendous successes in terms of our institutional awareness of our own history. I think a pathway forward is to find ways to revolutionize the way that we treat history, so that people understand what to do with history. And as I said when the conversation started, when I teach music history, I talk about, here is this artifact, this thing that happened in music 500 years ago. And it happened because these people lived this way. And we still see it in music of Trinidad and Tobago today. And we have new things developing out of that cell. I think that we have an opportunity here. If we teach people with a renewed sense of vigor and purpose how to use history, I think that we would put the younger generation on a more secure path for the future, because they will not just be looking at history as a subject that you learn in school, but history as a key to unlock where we have been and where we are and where we could be headed.
Thank you so much, panelists. This has been a very invigorating and informative conversation. And it remains now for me to offer you a vote of thanks. And so we wish to thank the chairman of UTT, Professor Clement Imber, VP of Research, Academic and Student Affairs, and Acting President of UTT, Professor Prakash Prasad. Our esteemed panelists, thank you so much again for your contributions. Gansha Mohammed of Research, Academic and Student Affairs for helping us organize and troubleshoot the technical difficulties for this event. Ladies and gentlemen, for your time and your consideration and your questions. Idul Adha Mubarak and happy emancipation. And thank you so much for paying attention, contributing, having a lively discussion.
Before you finish, may I have just one word? Before you finish, go ahead. Or you want it now? Go ahead now.
Yes.
I just want to tell Pearl and Two Springer, stop calling the wrong number. That's it.
Very well, sir.
That's it, Kayla, that's it.
And with that very important request, I would like to leave you all now with a performance from our very own students at APA. Thank you for joining us. Please enjoy. This is one of the little success stories that we can share coming out of the Revolution for Emancipation.
Need to hear?
Yeah.
Not hearing anything?
No, not hearing anything.
I'm trying to lose our technician.
That's one of the old movies before the talkies out.